So I want to move on to our second talk now. Again, it's not an extensive teaching session here. I'm just going to give you some pointers here from my 25 years of experience of things that I think are really important pitfalls to try and avoid. The first is that we need to understand ourselves as leaders and develop ourselves as leaders. This really comes out from what we were saying earlier about thinking about who we are. Am I a manager? Am I a leader? Am I an entrepreneurial leader? Am I risk averse? Do I need to find other people to work alongside me in getting this venture going? If you've decided that you are a leader, and maybe even an entrepreneurial leader, we do need to understand who we are as leaders, what our characteristic is of leadership. I find that many leaders are not terribly self-aware. They're not really aware of their strengths and of their weaknesses. They get into a position of leadership and they default to what I call positional leadership. I'm the CEO, or I'm the pastor even, and I'm the boss. So now I can dictate what we do. Why? Well, because I have the authority to tell you what to do. That's what I call positional leadership. And you need to think about what is your style of leadership and how much that style that you have is maybe influenced by your culture. We'll come on to that in a minute. Paul urges us in Romans 12:3 that we should not think of ourselves more highly than we should, but think about ourselves with sober judgment. And I think no more so than leaders that we should think about ourselves with sober judgment. We can do a tremendous amount of damage as leaders in an organization, in a Christian organization, if we do not understand ourselves and think about ourselves with sober judgment. We can cause all sorts of pain and hurt and disruption in communities, even a negative impact on the world in which we live when we're trying to reach them and witness to them for Christ, just by the way that we behave as leaders and as an organization. We need to think, therefore, then, about our leadership style. And there's a lot of research on leadership style that's been done looking at how cultures in particular impact leadership style. But before we sort of think about what your cultural default might be, let's just look quickly at what those styles might be along a continuum, because it's often true that we're not just one or the other. But the continuum is basically at the one end we have an autocratic or authoritarian style of leadership. You will do this because I'm the boss and I'm telling you to do it. Go away and do it. That's the sort of authoritarian style. The other end of the spectrum is the delegation or laissez-faire style. Yeah, fine, that's good. You want to do that, just go ahead. You go do it. Now, good leaders will actually mix the styles. Bad leaders will stick at either end of that spectrum. If you're naturally a sort of controlling, authoritarian sort of person, be very careful. Think about yourself. Come to understand yourself. Because if you stick at that end of the spectrum, you will cause havoc within your organization. You will cause destruction and pain. And you probably will keep the organization from reaching its objectives. On the other hand, if you're at the other end of the spectrum, you're very laid back and, yeah, let's just go with it, go with the flow. You probably won't achieve your objectives and your vision, because actually there does need to be some structure and some direction in an organization. So balancing those ends of the spectrum, those styles, if you like, is an important part of leadership. Knowing when it's important to say, this is what we're going to do, guys. And when it's, oh, that's a good idea, yeah, go run with that for a few weeks and then come back and see how it's going. Now, there's some interesting points about power, this whole idea of positional authority, if you like, or power. And the famous fourth president of the US, James Madison, said that the essence of government is power, and power, lodged as it must be in human hands, will ever be liable to abuse. You do have a position of power if you're in leadership. That's what comes with the territory. But because we are also sinners, that power that you have can be abused. And that's the point, really, that James Madison is saying. For Christians, it should not be like that. Why should it not be like that? Because the Apostle Peter says to us, do not lord it over those in your charge, speaking of elders, those who are leading God's people in the church, but be examples to the flock. So we basically need to know who we are as leaders. Are we control freaks? Are we authoritarian? Are we laissez-faire? Are we cognizant of what we're like? Now, what I've found in working in Eastern Europe quite a bit and also in Africa, I have personally, over the last 10 years or so, become much more sensitized to the impact that culture has on default leadership styles, even in the church. And basically, what you can find is along that spectrum, this is a bit of a caricature. Obviously, not everybody is like this, but you go into some parts of the world, Malaysia, for example, very autocratic, authoritarian leadership style. Austria, much more delegative or laissez-faire. And this basically maps onto what we can call doing or being cultures. In those who have done analysis of culture, basically divided into two types. It's quite interesting that many countries do fall into one or the other. So doing cultures are very individualistic. Power is actually much less important in a doing culture. It's getting on with the job, reaching the milestone. And status, that is, whether you're the CEO or not, is something that you earn in the process. Being cultures, which actually parts of Eastern Europe are, like Romania, and very similar, I've found, to Kenya, they're being cultures. So relationship is all very important. So you'll be writing a report, you've got to get it out by such and such a time, or maybe at lunchtime. A friend comes in back off of holiday, and you'll drop everything and catch up. A doing culture will be, let's catch up after lunch. I've got to get this report done by lunchtime. You see the difference? Now, leadership tends to fall into being essentially more laissez-faire in a doing culture and much more authoritarian in a being culture. How these cultures map onto leadership are quite important in a number of dimensions, because being culture status is something that you're given. It's positional status, if you like. I'm the pastor, right, so I have authority. Why? Because I'm the pastor. Whereas in a doing culture, that positional authority tends to be achieved. It's because people respect that individual and they got, if you like, promoted or put into the role because of that. But there are some other consequences that are quite important. Let's just pick one. The issue of long-term planning. In a doing culture, people are very much more into the idea of long-term planning. In a being culture, it's much more, what are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do today? That has some consequences in terms of how well you plan, and how, if you were thinking about the strategic plan, a being culture might not even think of a 5-year plan, let alone a 15-year plan, maybe not even of a year plan. I'm caricaturing a little bit, but do you see the idea? So think about that in terms of your culture, where you come from, and how that might impact. Just one other quick example of how culture can influence us as leaders. This is something I've noted quite a bit over the last few years. In the Western cultures, the impact of social media in terms of emphasizing image. I remember teaching on an MBA course once where they told me that some professor had said that they needed to have, I don't know what it was, something like 670 likes on Facebook. So I basically looked at the student and told me that, and I said, why? And we had a wonderful half-hour discussion about that whole issue. And what actually fell out of the discussion was the amount of effort and stress that goes into keeping your status up there so people keep liking you and more people keep liking you. Unpack that as a Christian. What's that about as a leader? It's about image. It's about status. I don't think that that's a biblical model of leadership. I don't see anywhere that reflected in the concept of serving others and being a servant leader. So just watch that one, because I think there is a great danger, even as Christians, of just letting the world squeeze us into its mold. Why are we doing it? Well, because everybody's doing it. It's what you have to do. Okay, so that's understanding yourself as a leader. One thing that I think is important, understand the impact that your culture has on you in terms of maybe your default leadership style and the default leadership style of others around you. I want to just move on to a third item that I think is important to watch in leadership, and that is our character. Again, this is just reflection of many years of dealing with trauma, failed leadership, all of the fallout from failed leadership, whether it's in business or mostly in church organizations, tragically, where we ought to know better how to be and how to act as believers. And I want to say to you that you can pick up a huge amount in terms of skills development. There's a lot of that going on here at the forum, and that's great. You should do that. You should develop, wherever possible, your skills base. But there are two aspects I want to suggest of leadership. One is what skills we have, but foundational to that is our character. And without developing our character before God, doesn't matter how many skills you've got, how good you are at this or that or the other, if we don't have a character, if we're just literally going by the book rather than out of the character, then failure will emerge. And I think this is no more true than in times of crises, because in a time of crises, do you go and get Jim Collins down from the shelf or your favorite management guru? You don't. What you actually do is respond out of the habits of the heart. And the habits of the heart basically are essentially an important part of who you are, your character. Sorry, I thought this slide was up. So character is basically, I describe as the overlap, the congruence between our belief system and the moral code that for us as Christians is an intimate part of that belief system, our Christian worldview, and our behavior. As Christians, we can be in great danger of knowing a great deal up here, and knowing our Bibles, and knowing our theology. But actually, I find time and time again that our behavior as Christians, and especially Christian leaders, does not sit well with that head knowledge, that moral code that comes with the Bible's teaching and our belief system. So the more in which our beliefs are, I call it a Christian worldview of leadership, actually is impacting our behavior, the more we are developing a character that is in the likeness of our Lord. And that's what we're called to as leaders. I want to say to you that we're called to be that, whether we're in business or whether we're in Christian service. There's no excuses, I don't believe, that wherever God has placed us, whatever we're doing, we should be striving to be godly people in the way in which we behave and execute our leadership. I want to move on quickly now to the fourth point, and that is maintaining financial discipline. And this is an area that I do find sometimes gets overlooked. The reason is that as Christians there is a great danger of us saying the Lord will provide. All we need to do is to trust in God, have enough faith, pray sufficiently, and God will meet our financial needs. We should pray. We should trust in our God with all our heart and lean not unto our own understanding. He will direct and make straight our paths. God will meet our need as He sees it, not as we think we perceive it. So there's a great danger and a temptation to rely on the idea that God will just put money into your bank account without you actually having the disciplines of managing it. One key tool I want to just leave you with to go and research about if you're not practiced at it is cash flow management. That's simply knowing when money is going to come in, actually come in, not when you hope it might come in. So that's when money comes in, top line, and when you know money is going out. Normally, we know exactly on what date of the month money is going out for salaries, rent of the office, our phone contract, and so on. Cash flow management is just making sure that we have enough cash coming in to meet the needs as they fall. And in most countries, there's actually a legal requirement to do that, to actually manage your cash flow to ensure that you don't end up owing anybody. And I would say to you that the Bible balances this faith, this life of faith, life of prayer, with also a responsibility to act. This is this behavior side. Yes, we must have faith, but also we must act responsibly, not presuming on God, but acting responsibly. So we need to manage our organization to make sure that we're not going to run out of money. That might mean that you then have to do some planning. You can see there's a fall off in donations or whatever. What are we going to do to replace that? And sometimes we have to take the difficult step of maybe winding our organization down, but we should do that not owing anybody anything. I believe that's a biblical ethic. We can talk more about that in the Q&A time if you like. I'm going to wind up in just 1 minute with the last slide. Also, as Christian leaders in our organization, let's have a right view of success. We all like success, don't we? And if we're all honest, we measure success quantitatively. And unfortunately, one of the fallouts of our free market system is that over the years, success is something that we quantify. How many baptisms this year? How many converts from Generation Y or in our neighborhoods have we achieved? We basically put numbers around everything. And sometimes the numbers don't come out. Sometimes in a numerical sense, we cannot see any success at all. I believe that we need to measure success in a different way. Think about the farm that we just lost all of that money, all of the crops, all of it for a good cause, not to line our pockets, but to go into God's work there in Africa. We have to step back from that and say, what is God saying to us? Our sovereign God was in charge of all of this. From a worldly perspective, even from other Christians' perspective, this is a disaster. Surely this doesn't happen in God's work. It does. And our sovereign God allows things like that to happen, to teach us things, and maybe to mold us, to show us to go in another direction. Maybe the lesson that we have to learn is to depend on Him, not on our finances, not on our good farming techniques or our good evangelism techniques and practice. So we need to start thinking about success in a non-capitalist free market way. I'm not saying that quantifying things is a bad idea. I'm saying that that should not be the only metric that we use. We need to have in mind, how does our God, who has called us to this work, view the outcomes of what we're doing? What is his agenda? And it is not always what our agenda is.